Good morning, evening, afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are on the planet, welcome to episode 3 of that Racing History podcast with me, Aidan Millward. Now, today is Easter Monday, so Bank Holiday Monday in the UK, the day after Easter Sunday. So I hope you had a great Zombie Jesus Day, or if you're non-observant, I just hope you had a great weekend. Now, obviously, that whole intro gets thrown out the window when this gets uploaded to podcast networks like Spotify, but for the YouTube audience at least, it's Monday. Yeah, time paradoxes and stuff like that. But today, I've got an episode that is almost 2 years overdue, given that whenever a legend of motorsport dies, I get bombarded with the questions of, will there be a video on? And I tend to shy away from it because doing a video on someone that's just died, to me at least, sounds a bit dickish. Hey, someone's just died, let's get a video up immediately and fill it with mid-roll ads. I can't do it, but I did do one on Murray Walker, but even then it took nearly a week to do so, and the same for Sabine Schmitz. But today, a brand new episode, one that you won't have heard before, and it's actually someone I quite admired in motorsport. The 3-time Formula 1 World Champion, the airline pilot, the airline owner, and part of the Mercedes dream team that, at the time of writing, has dominated Formula 1 for the last 7 years. But if you are listening in 2033, dominating Formula 1 for the last 19 years. Today's podcast focuses on the legend that is Niki Lauda. Lauda was born in Vienna in Austria on the 22nd of February 1949, and his family was involved in paper manufacturing. And that, in turn, was a very successful business, and the family overall was, indeed, very, very wealthy. His great-grandfather, Ernst Lauda, worked in hydraulic engineering and bridge building, and then Niki's grandfather, Hans, was also an industrialist, being the general manager of Weitsche. Now, Hans was actually removed from that position following the Anschluss, which was Nazi Germany marching into Austria, but he was given the job back after the war, and that's where the paper-making empire for the Laudas grew. Now, despite Hans being a massive racing fan, often driving to the Nurburgring and to Monaco to go and watch Grand Prix races, he disapproved of Niki getting involved as a driver by basically saying, the Lauda name needs to be on the economic pages of the newspapers, not the back pages with all the sport. And Niki touched upon his early years in an interview with Graham Bensinger filmed back in 2017, where he mentioned that he had a cook, a butler, a driver, and basically everything that a super rich family would typically have. And when his mother decided that the driver should take Niki and his brother to school, Lauda insisted that the driver drop him off about 100 yards or so away from the gate so he could feel the normality of walking up to the school like everybody else had to, and feel like he was like everybody else, despite the wealth. And Niki, like Jackie Stewart, was not a bright kid. He didn't do particularly well at school, and he wasn't an academic by any stretch. Much like Jackie and myself, come to think of it, but Niki was better with his hands, and he was put onto an auto mechanic apprenticeship by his father, who, just like Rihanna, was all about the work. And he didn't last particularly long doing that apprenticeship. He was asked to change the oil on a car, and hadn't quite grasped the concept of lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. He was turning the screw, or whatever it is, on the oil sump the wrong way, and knackered the thread on it, so the customer wasn't particularly happy that the car had to spend another 2 days in the shop getting fixed. So he went back to school, where he failed all of his exams except maths and religion. And in this same interview with Graham Bensinger, Niki stated that a girl in his class said, "Hey, look, I've passed my exams," and one of his mates said, "You know, I can make her results look like your results." So he added Niki's name onto the top of the piece of paper, forged the whole thing, and then Niki was able to show his dad that he wasn't a total failure. It was an obvious forgery. In Niki's own words, it could have been seen about 100 metres away. But his parents bought it. So now Niki was able to do what he wanted. He was free. He was able to go and get a job. He was able to go and do whatever the hell he wanted. So long as the parents approved. And you know how it can be sometimes. You can be whatever you want to be, son, as long as it's a doctor or a lawyer or a surgeon, and as I said earlier, any dreams of racing were shut down by the family. The Lauda name had to be on the business pages of the papers, not the sports ones. But that didn't stop him. Niki decided that cars was what he wanted to do, specifically racing them. And he first started with a Mini and then moved up to Formula V, which is a bit like Formula Ford, but it's based off the VW Beetle instead. And like many before, and even more since, his career hit a brick wall, and his family would not support his racing, cutting him out of the family will, and in turn, he had a massive falling out with his grandfather. So Niki had a new drive, no pun intended. he had to do well at racing to really stick a middle finger up to his family. So Niki needed more money. He had been receiving money from a local bank as a sponsor, and the bank had been sponsoring him through Formula V. So the next step was to go into Formula 2, and then onwards to Formula 1. And the money required was something in the region of about $180,000 to get a ride with March. But just before the bank was about to approve the extra money for him to go into Formula 2, the family stepped in and blocked the sponsorship. So he went to another bank and took out a loan. And there was no time to find another sponsor, so a loan was the only way of fulfilling contract obligations. And Niki managed to talk his way into getting the money, and agreed to pay it back over 5 years with 0 interest. Which is much better than getting one of these, Wonga.com payday loans with 10 billion% interest or whatever it is on them. The loan was secured with some life insurance. If Niki was killed racing, then the money the insurance company paid out would go to the bank and nowhere else. He could now race for March in both Formula 2 and Formula 1 in 1971, and then into 1972, but he had to find some way of paying it all off. So what do you do when you have a bank loan of many thousands of dollars to pay off while racing? If you're Niki Lauda, you take out another one and buy your way into BRM for a full season in 1973. But the days of Graham Hill and Jackie Stewart were long, long ago, and the team was on the way out of Formula 1. The car was unreliable, but when it did work, Lauda was able to show what he could do. And he did enough to attract the attention of Enzo Ferrari, after running as high as third in the 1973 Monaco Grand Prix. At the end of 1973, Clay Regazzoni left BRM to join Ferrari for 1974, and Enzo asked the Argentine what he thought of Lauda's talent. Regazzoni said so many good things about Lauda that Enzo signed him up and at the same time agreed to pay off every single penny of Lauda's bank loans. And while at Ferrari, Lauda showed his balls of steel. Not because he was racing at an incredibly dangerous time in motorsport history, but because he dared to stand up to Enzo Ferrari. And I'm sure you've all heard this story. It's in the movie Rush, and it actually happened, albeit slightly differently. While in the movie, Lauda pulls up in the car, and the guy says, how good is it? And he says, nah, not good, man. It was actually Piero Ferrari that was acting as a translator between Enzo and Niki, as neither could speak the other's language. So Enzo was there when it actually happened. And like I say, it's portrayed a little bit different in the film, but the basic gist is the same. Piero was told by his father to ask Niki what he thought of the car. And Niki just said, the car's shit. What do you mean? The car's shit? Look, you can't say that. Why not? And Enzo stepped in and basically said, wait, you dare tell me that a Ferrari is no good? And Niki straight up looked Enzo in the eye and said, yes, it's shit. Any other man on the planet would have been fired then and there, and all contracts ripped up, set on fire and dumped into the nearest river. But Enzo somehow didn't have anybody killed. So Enzo asked what was wrong, and Niki gave all of the feedback. Understeering, it's doing this, it's doing that, yada yada yada. And Enzo said, okay, if we fix it, how much faster will you go? 0.3. 0.3. Okay, we'll fix it. But if you're not 0.3 or more faster, you're sacked. Niki went half a second faster with the fixes and kept his job. And when the season started properly for Ferrari in 1974, Niki was second in the season opening Argentine Grand Prix, and 3 races later, he was a race winner in Spain. But the Ferrari of 1974 wasn't reliable enough to win the championship, but Lauda kept on plugging and worked with the team to develop the car. 1975 was just as mixed. He couldn't finish any better than 5th in the first 4 races of the season, but then the new Ferrari 312T arrived and he won 4 of the next 5, wrapping up the title at Ferrari's home race at Monza. And in that same year, he became the first man to lap the old Nurburgring in under 7 minutes, but failed to win there when he picked up a puncture and dropped down the order on the 10th lap. But somehow, he still clawed it back to 3rd after James Hunt retired and Tom Pryce was forced to slow down with car problems. And Ferrari kept up that winning formula into 1976, possibly the most famous season of Formula 1 thanks to the movie Rush that I've mentioned before. Lauda won 4 of the first 6 races, and in the 2 he didn't win, he was second. So come the British Grand Prix, he had more than double the points of James Hunt and the championship should have been easy pickings. But then the Formula 1 circus had to pay its annual visit to the Nurburgring. Lauda was big into his racing safety, much like Jackie Stewart before him, and he was urging the drivers to boycott the track until safety improvements were made. The cars were getting too fast for the Nurburgring, as well as the circuit owners being a bit tight when it came to paying for said improvements as the track was over 14 miles long. There was also a lack of firefighting equipment and not enough marshals to monitor the entire track. If someone was to have an accident at the furthest point on the track away from the pits, it could prove fatal. And all those concerns came back to bite Lauda as he crashed at the kink before Burvert Corner. Now, it's not known what caused the accident, although many think it was either a puncture or suspension failure. Either way, it was a big one. The car caught fire and Lauda was trapped inside the wreckage as it burned. But luckily, Brett Lunger, Arturo Mazzario, Guy Edwards and Harold Ertl arrived to help, and they managed to get Lauda out. Niki had inhaled toxic gases from burning fiberglass on the car, and his lungs were scorched and some of those toxins had entered his bloodstream. Ferrari was also using a different type of seatbelt to everybody else, and because Mazzario had once tested a Ferrari, he knew how they worked. And while Niki was conscious and able to stand when he got out of the car, he quickly dropped to the floor and went into a coma. Nobody thought he was going to survive, and he was read the last rites by a Catholic priest while in the hospital. But he somehow lived. He suffered extensive scarring on his head that took his hair, his eyebrows were burned off, his eyelids were also burned off, and he also lost part of his right ear. The only plastic surgery he had after the accident was for new eyelids to be constructed, and seeing some business opportunities later on, he always wore a red hat to cover those scars on his scalp, and he later sold advertising space on them for about $1 million a throw. He spent a long time in hospital, having all the gunge sucked out of his lungs through a vacuum, and he was also seeing James Hunt on television clawing back the championship, and Lauda wanted to be back in the car as soon as possible. Now, Ferrari actually boycotted the next round in Austria as Enzo felt the authorities had a bias towards Hunt and McLaren after the Spanish and British Grand Prix, where there were a couple of controversies going against the team. But despite the injuries and the hospital time, he only missed the Austrian and Dutch Grand Prix, and he returned at Monza just 6 weeks after the accident, and Hunt only had a 2-point deficit to Lauda in first place. Niki was still bandaged up and had to peel these blood-soaked bandages off after every driving stint and replace them, and had to wear an adapted helmet to ease discomfort. But Niki, despite being in considerable pain and not looking yet ready to race, finished 4th while Hunt spun off. But Hunt quickly staged a comeback in Canada at Watkins Glen to set up the finale at Fuji, where it hammered down. Niki decided that after just a couple of laps to withdraw. He couldn't blink and his eyes were constantly watering due to the damaged tear ducts. And as we all know, Hunt would win the title after finishing 3rd. But Lauda was completely unapologetic over withdrawing and losing the title. It was better than getting killed. This caused him and Enzo to fall out. While Lauda would win the 1977 title, his relationship with Enzo had soured, and he really didn't get along with his new teammate Carlos Reutemann. But while Niki was due to leave at the end of the season, he quit after winning the world title at Watkins Glen, and this was after Enzo had allowed a young Canadian called Gilles Villeneuve to run in the 3rd car at the next round at Mosport. So the next place to drive was at Brabham, and Niki got the chance to race the famed Brabham fan car at the Swedish Grand Prix, before team owner Bernie Eccleston voluntarily withdrew it for being too good. But many retirements and declining results in races he did finish all caused Niki to call time on his career at the end of the 1979 Canadian Grand Prix. He'd also founded an airline company and wanted to run that full-time instead. But then in 1982, Lauda returned to Formula 1, driving for McLaren. Critics and sponsors were worried that the Austrian was past it and instead should have stayed flying planes, but it took just 3 races for him to get back to winning ways, which he did on the streets of Long Beach. Lauda also led the driver's strike, which formed a big part of the FISA-FOCA war that I'll have to cover at some point just to avoid this particular episode going on forever. Niki would then win the 1984 world title by the slimmest margin ever, 0.5 a point from Alain Prost, all because of the shortened Monaco Grand Prix of that year. McLaren won 12 of the 16 races that season, which stood as the most wins by a team in history until the record was beaten in 1988 by McLaren, and on both occasions Prost finished runner-up. But at the end of 1985, he called time on his career for good and went back to the airlines. But in 1991, Lauda Air would suffer a tragic accident that could have ruined Niki's reputation. Lauda Air 004 was flying from Bangkok, Thailand to Vienna when the aircraft lost control and slammed into the ground, killing every single one of the 223 people on board. The 767 that was involved had only been with Lauda Air 2 years. The aircraft family as a whole had been introduced about 10 years before, and at the time had an absolutely spotless accident record. That is, if you include Air Canada Flight 143, better known as the Gimli glider, which had to land with no fuel at a disused airfield after the ground crews forgot they were working in metric and not imperial. It was the first total loss of a 767 in its life. And after the crash, Lauda travelled to Thailand to personally look at the crash site, since he felt a duty to figure out what happened to this plane that killed 223 people and wanted to give the families some sort of closure. He wanted to know if it was the fault of Lauda Air, in which case if it was he'd resign, or if it was down to someone else. And the long story short, and I'm sure there's a full documentary on the internet that you can watch if you want to learn more, because this is motorsport stuff rather than plane stuff, even though both things are cool. Basically, what happened, the thrust reverser on one of the engines of this Boeing 767 activated while in flight, causing the plane to crash. It was a design fault on the plane, and nothing to do with Lauda Air. So responsibility was laid at the feet of Boeing in Seattle. But Boeing didn't want to take responsibility. So Niki asked Boeing to recreate the situation at a simulator at Gatwick Airport, which is just south of London, but Boeing wouldn't do it. Instead, Niki flew the flight instead, and every time the thrust reversers activated in flight, he crashed. Boeing maintained that the thrust reverser being deployed in flight was impossible, but Lauda persisted, and Boeing then issued a statement saying, yes, it's our design fault that caused this, not Lauda Air's and not Pratt & Whitney's. Pratt & Whitney being the people that made the actual jet turbine engines on the plane. But Niki couldn't stay away from Formula One forever. 2 years later, in 1993, Luca de Montezemolo hired him as a consultant at Ferrari. In 1994, he was part of the reformation of the Grand Prix Drivers Association following the deaths of Ratzenberger and Senna at Imola, and then in 2001 became the team principal for the Jaguar Formula One team, which was being run as Ford's factory team, but got sacked at the end of the 2002 season for poor results. Then in 2012, he became a non-executive chairman at the Mercedes Formula One team, and was the man who convinced Lewis Hamilton to leave McLaren and join Mercedes, and the team went on to win 7 Constructors and Drivers' Championships in a row since 2014, at the time of writing, with Hamilton winning 6 of them. But Lauda would never get to see Lewis win his 6th and 7th world titles, as he passed away in 2019 just before the Monaco Grand Prix. He'd been undergoing treatment for kidney problems, and earlier that year had also been hospitalised with the flu. In 2018, he had a lung transplant, and his wife donated a kidney to him in 2005. And one of his children, Matthias Lauda, also races cars, and while in the Euro NASCAR series, his teammate was a guy called Freddie Hunt. Yeah, Freddie Hunt. James's son, Freddie Hunt. There's a chunk of great Niki Lauda interviews on the internet, either as part of Formula One programming or the Graham Bensinger interview that sheds more detail on things in his life, which I highly urge you to go and watch. And I use that interview to make up a lot of this podcast episode, so you may end up hearing the same stuff again here or there if you've already watched it. If you're a Formula One fan, you probably have. Either way, it's still fantastic viewing, and I watch it probably 2 or 3 times a year. Niki Lauda was an icon of Formula One, a man who went to the gates of hell and went, yeah, not for me, I'm out, and got back into a racing car despite almost meeting his end in one. The guy was a legend, and one of the greatest racing drivers of all time. So if you have enjoyed this episode, those on YouTube can click the like button, and while there, if you're not subscribed, subscribe, get the bell on and all that stuff so you'll get more of these. And if you've discovered this podcast through Spotify's recommended, through other sporting podcasts you might be listening to, why not follow? Because there is plenty more where this came from. That Racing History Podcast is a Patreon-backed show, and if you wish to help support this podcast or just my YouTube channel in general at a more personal level, then you can do so by heading to the Patreon page at patreon.com/AidanMillward. That's AidanMillward. So Aidan with an A and not an E. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and all that good stuff. And there is also a Discord where you can join in the chat there. For YouTube listeners, all that stuff is handily in the description box for you. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward with That Racing History Podcast. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.